I'm here with Dorothy Gasque, a congressional candidate running in Washington State's 3rd District. She's actually a neighbor of mine because I'm in Portland, Oregon. I actually went to school in your district, community college. So it's really nice to have a neighbor on who is a progressive. Welcome, Dorothy.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
I'm actually happy to hear you went to college here.
yeah,
Was it Clark?
I went to Longview Community College.
Oh,
It
Longview.
was, yeah, I was there for a couple of years. I was a little bit behind, but it was a lovely area. So yeah, I had the pleasure, just so everyone knows, of meeting Dorothy and her volunteers at the live Jimmy Dore show. I don't think I've ever met people with that level of energy, and their enthusiasm was contagious. Like I was automatically excited for you. And I hadn't heard anything about your campaign beforehand. So what are you doing to generate this much excitement? Because this is purely grassroots. You're not taking a dime in corporate cash. So what do you think is generating all of this excitement? I want your secret.
I think it's just an eagerness for change. I mean, I don't think I didn't spark this. Bernie did.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, I can totally agree with that. Now, what's really unique about your campaign is that you actually have this really bold anti-war stance, but this is fueled by the fact that you're a veteran. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that your position on this is important because you have credibility. You've seen war firsthand. So tell me what you saw and why it kind of led you to this anti-war progressive stance.
Well, it actually starts before I deployed. So I was stationed at the National Training Center, which is in the Mojave Desert of California. And it was our job to create these realistic battle scenarios for the troops that are about to deploy. And so we would take on the role of Iraqi civilians and insurgents and terrorists and try to create these realistic situations. We would do like mock elections, and we had these like mock villages out in the Mojave Desert, and we would stay there for our entire time living in buildings out there. And we got to see things from the perspective of somebody living in Iraq who hadn't done anything wrong, who was just trying to survive, and seeing how much miscommunication can harm things, or just simple mistakes can lead to big problems, and understanding that everything we were doing was just to mitigate violence. And we weren't solving any problems. There wasn't any mission to really succeed at. And then deploying with my unit, we were considered the best trained unit in the military. So we deployed knowing, having seen things from the other side, we did a really good job. We had a third the size of the force from the unit that we took over, but and we did the best that we could. And even then there were civilian casualties, and it's just heartbreaking. Destruction of the country that is our fault. Kids couldn't go to school without having to deal with improvised explosive devices, but they would still go every day to school. And just that violence wasn't there before we. And I think that just gave me a real perspective on how bad things were.
I watched the short documentary with you that featured you in your campaign, and something you said really was poignant. You said that there were people in Iraq that were angry at the fact that, the US they had invaded that country, and you guys were seen as outsiders, obviously, because you were. And you said, look, I can see where they're coming from, because if someone invaded America, I would view them the same exact way. So why is it, and this is really difficult because I'm basically going to ask you to psychoanalyze Americans, but why do you think that there's this huge lack of empathy when it comes to foreign policy issues, specifically with regard to people in government? Like, why don't they care that we're causing death and destruction around the world?
I think that there's just a lack of real understanding. This is probably the first war in American history in which, like, even the media is sort of blocked from filming what's going on.
Yeah.
What we called these green zones that are really well secured, and that's where the media was located. And so they weren't really out with us in some of the more dangerous areas, and so they didn't even really get a perspective on this. It's a very sanitized perspective of war. And I think there's so much money that comes from the defense industry and that goes into their pockets. So they're paid to turn a blind eye to what's going on. And then you've got the fossil fuel industry too, which has got an interest in the Middle East. I mean, a lot of what we did was for oil.
Right. And you're kind of touching on, I think, one of the biggest planks of your platform, which is corporate money in politics. We have this system where large multinational corporations can legally bribe politicians, and it's viewed under, Supreme Court cases like McCutcheon and Citizens United as perfectly illegal. And there's not even the appearance of corruption, as the McCutcheon, I think, ruling opinion stated. So can you talk about what we can do politically, and what types of policies we could implement to mitigate that level of corruption? Do you think that we can do it with legislation alone, or do you think we actually need to amend the Constitution and ban money as a form of free speech?
Well, I think the first step is getting involved in organizations like Represent Us and Wolfpack, and really working at that grassroots level to change at the local, state, and the national level through legislation. And it's going to have to come through legislation first. And there are things we can do. So Represent Us has the American Anti-Corruption Act, which is what I run at the top of my platform. And this can be done with a simple majority in the House and the Senate. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment, which makes it a lot easier. But I do think eventually that constitutional amendment office, who are not beholden to big money interest.
Can you repeat what you said? You were kind of splitting up there. You were talking about the constitutional amendment. Can you say that one more time?
All right, let me try and remember. I think that eventually we do need to amend the Constitution, but it's going to take 2/3 of the Senate, and it's going to take the states to ratify it. And so that's a long-term process, but we can do it by legislation first, by passing the American Anti-Corruption Act and doing things like banning lobbyists from being able to donate to candidates.
Yeah.
There's an example I give. So as a federal candidate, I can't take any money from a federal contractor. But if a company is a federal contractor, they can hire a lobbyist, and that lobbyist can donate. So we have to close that loophole that allows that influence to happen through campaign donations from lobbyists. And so they can go to industries, leaders, and get money from them, and then put that into politicians' accounts too. And they're really able then to influence legislation. And it's not that difficult. If you think about how Congress works, a bill goes into committee, and that's where it either dies or goes to the floor.
Yep.
And committees are only a few people. Some of them are about 13 to 15 members. And so paying off half that committee isn't that difficult.
Yeah. You're making a great point. And I'm curious how you would respond to the centrist neoliberal, I guess you could say, counter argument that says, look, you can't show up to a gunfight with a knife. So why don't you just take corporate money now, and when you get in office, you just betray all of your donors? So why do you think it's so important to prove to people that you're not taking corporate money and putting yourself essentially at a disadvantage by rejecting that corporate money? Why is remaining principled important to you?
I think because the only way that people are going to trust you and actually show up to help is if you don't take that corporate money. I have no faith in anyone who says they can take it and then go in and regulate, because I've been hearing that for my whole adult life since I've been voting.
It's almost like we've been betrayed by people who take corporate money before.
Yeah. And I think I am bringing, I feel like with the people power, I'm bringing a machine gun to this fight.
I like that.
There's nothing more powerful than the power of people uniting and fighting together.
Right. And honestly, it's been shown now with the victories of progressives across the country, Ben Jealous, Emily Sirota, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that you can still be competitive and reject corporate cash. And now that you guys are starting to win across the country, I think that neoliberals are probably getting worried because they don't have this excuse anymore. They can't say, well, look, I'm just taking corporate money, but my goal is to end Citizens United. They can't really say that anymore because you guys are proving that it can be done. And which is why I love all of these grassroots candidates. I love organizations like Brand New Congress and Justice Democrats because, it really does demonstrate the power that is in the grassroots, and it's amazing. I think your volunteers are doing such a fantastic job on the issue of money in politics. Can you point to a few specific policies that the American people are in favor of that isn't being passed or codified into law specifically because special interests are funding politicians to oppose it?
Oh, like specific legislation?
Yeah, anything in particular.
So Medicare for All is a big one.
Right.
So 60% of the population now wants a Medicare for All style program. And that's not going to happen until we get rid of the influence of the health insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry. I think 50 million last year. And the pharmaceutical industry spent over like 250.
Say that one more time. You're breaking up. You were talking about the pharmaceutical industry spending.
So the pharmaceutical industry spent about $250 million last year.
That's insane.
And so they're buying that. That's influence they're buying. And lobbying has about a 4,000% return on investment.
I did not know that. That's horrifying. So here's what I want to ask you. Because I think that you're taking really principled stances on issues. You want to get money out of politics. Would you support anti-corruption laws that are basically lifetime bans on politicians becoming lobbyists? Do you think that goes too extreme? What else can we do besides publicly financing elections that mitigates corruption at a broader level? Because I think it's just rampant.
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to do a lifetime ban. I do think like a 5-year ban is enough to have kind of changed the face of politics so their influence is reduced. And as long as you're getting rid of that ability for them to finance campaigns, then they're just there to educate. And that's an important part of lobbying. Lobbying is protected by the First Amendment. It is a person's or group's ability to educate politicians about issues they may not know about. And so we do need that, but we don't need them to be able to finance campaigns.
Right. That's a huge point. And one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is that even if these lobbyists or multinational corporations aren't buying off politicians, they are buying complacency in some instances. So, for example, some Democrats might receive funding from the NRA to not oppose specific measures that they want implemented. So it goes both ways, really. And corruption is just rampant, which is why I think that these types of grassroots campaigns like yours and Ocasio-Cortez's and others who are running are particularly important. So let me ask you this. This is something that I always like to ask congressional candidates. There's so much going on right now, and if we really wanted to fix our country, there'd be like 100 different policies that we'd have to legislate on. So what would be a focus for you? What maybe top 3 issues would you prioritize if you were elected?
Well, top one is getting money out of politics. And the first thing I would do is try and pass a law to make it illegal for our representatives to fundraise during working hours. Mm-hmm. Currently, they spend 5 out of the 8 hours a day that we pay them calling people for donations for their next election and for their party. And that's something that if we end, talk about some of the other measures to get money out of politics. And I think after that, healthcare is a really big deal, but economic security is probably the biggest issue. And healthcare falls under that. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the one thing we hear the most in this district at this point, we're out there, we're knocking on doors, and the people we're talking to are struggling because their rent's going up, but their paychecks aren't. And so we've seen people who've gotten a $300 a month increase in their rent. And so that's just, it's unsustainable. Like people can't keep living like that.
Yeah, it's terrifying because they're losing their security, and if you get a rent increase of $300, then what's to say you're still gonna be able to live there next year? And it's gonna feel, this homeless crisis. There's a lot going on. There's so much. So, let me get down to specific bills here because I think this is important. So, if you were elected, would you co-sponsor HR 676, the Medicare for All bill?
Yeah, I'd like to see it beefed up and turned more into look like Senator Sanders' bill, but I would definitely support HR 676.
For sure. And I'd actually agree with you there. And I think that they'd probably have to reconcile both bills because from what I understand, Sanders' bill is kind of more of a companion to Conyers' bill. But yeah, I do agree. I think that we do have to kind of expand HR 676, but I'm glad to hear that. Another thing that I asked you about before in a previous interview I did with you for your Facebook page was I specifically asked about HR 3057. Now, for those of you who don't know what this is a bill that would end gerrymandering. It would make ranked choice voting the standard nationwide. And also it would move us from single member districts to multi-member districts, meaning that our electoral system would be more proportional and not winner take all. So would you co-sponsor something like that?
Yes, I'm actually really interested to see this multi-winner ranked choice voting on a smaller scale. I'm hoping they'll get it implemented somewhere in the United States. We're actually in Clark County, and we're hoping to be able to get it instituted for our Vancouver City Council races.
Yeah, that would be great. And I know that there's a huge push right now in Massachusetts that is trying to get ranked choice voting on the ballot for the state in 2020. So it does start locally. But yeah, this whole top-down approach in making ranked choice voting the standard would be, I think, it would have such a huge impact on our country. And of course, there's still more work to be done, of course, getting money out of politics, but electoral reform is still such an important part of that conversation. So I'm glad that you would kind of bring that discussion to Congress with you. So can you tell us what we can do if we want to get involved? For those of us that don't live in the Pacific Northwest, what can people in New York do if they want to support your campaign and make you the next Ocasio-Cortez?
Well, obviously, the most important thing is those small dollar donations. So our website is dorothyforcongress.com. You can just click on the button on there. We have a couple of options, Act Blue, Crowd Pack, send us a check. And if you become a monthly donor, you get a brick on our wall. So we put our monthly donors' names up on the wall. And but we also need phone bankers, so organizing phone banks through the Justice Dialer, and that's justicedialer.com. And you can just scroll down and you'll find our candidate. The upcoming primary should be moved to the top of the list for the Justice Dialer by now. And then the other thing is we have a volunteer link on our website. So if there's something else you want to do, graphic design, research, if you want to travel here and spend a weekend canvassing, those are always options. Just go ahead and fill out that volunteer form and our coordinator will get in touch with you.
All right. Well, that sounds good. And one last thing I want to ask you is in the event you were elected and Nancy Pelosi decides to run to be the House minority or majority speaker, what do you do in that instance? Do you vote yes, or do you support someone else like Barbara Lee?
I would not support Nancy Pelosi. I'm actually very excited by the idea that we can get a progressive champion like Barbara Lee. So
right.
I would put my vote.
I am very relieved to hear that. So is there anything else that you want to say before we leave that you think is important? Anything with regard to the election itself? Does anybody have to be registered as a Democrat to vote for you? Can independents vote for you? Anything just you want to put out there beforehand?
So it's an open primary. It's top two jungle, similar to what California runs on. I mean, we've been doing it longer. But it's you can vote for anybody can vote for us, and we don't register by party here at all.
That's great.
And it's by mail, and this year it will be postage paid. So you can just stick it back in the mail and it will be sent in for you.
All right. Well, you've heard it here first. Dorothy Gasque running for Congress in Washington's 3rd Congressional District. Hopefully you will join Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in Congress. I think the momentum really is behind progressives right now. So I'm watching all of these races. It's very exciting. Thank you so much for coming on, Dorothy.
Thank you for having me.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.